Hello, everybody. I've been working on this lecture for you. It is on um, addiction, recovery, and treatment. And I know that the lectures are going to be on substance use disorder today. So I really wanted to focus on something a bit different, something you're going to see that's going to be different than just substance use. And it's really the focus on addiction. So I've put together this slideshow. A lot of it's pretty research heavy. So I'm going to do my best to try and condense it and give you the best pearls of information in here all about substance use disorder and really more about addiction because there's a clear distinction between those two, addiction and substance use disorder. By the end of this lecture, I'm really hoping that you're going to have a pretty clear picture of what is addiction, what is recovery. It's very important to understand what is recovery and what are evidence-based treatments for addiction. So here we go. So as an overall organizer, we're going to be able to break this lecture up into these three different parts. There's the addiction part, then there's the recovery part, and then there's going to be the treatment part. And these are the 5 areas that we're going to talk about in the addiction section. So to get started, we're going to talk a little bit about some case vignettes. So here's the first one. This is John. John's a 22-year-old Latino male. He's employed full-time as an airplane mechanic. He drinks either beer or liquor almost every day, usually more than 4 drinks, and binges heavily on weekends. He will use substances like cocaine or cannabis when offered by others, and he began drinking when he was 16. So the question that I want you to keep in mind here is, if you were diagnosing John, would you give him substance use disorder? And importantly, is John an addict? Is John an alcoholic? Okay. So we're going to move on to the next question, case vignette, and I want you to ask yourself that same question. Would this person qualify for substance use disorder, and is this person an addict? Kate's a 37-year-old African-American, non-gender conforming female, experienced significant childhood trauma. Full-time law student, began drinking at the age of 14, usually drank till drunk and often experienced blackouts. Kate has not had a drink in 8 years. Does Kate qualify for a substance use disorder? Is Kate an alcoholic? Ash is a 19-year-old white female, full-time college student at a technical college, employed part-time in a restaurant. Began using cannabis at age 17 and vapes about $5 to $10 worth of cannabis daily. Switches to Juul when unable to use cannabis. Is Ash a substance user? Does Ash qualify for substance use disorder? And is Ash an addict in this case? So what you're going to come to find out is, first off, both John and Ash here do end up qualifying for substance use disorder. Kate probably does not, unless you want to give Kate the in remission qualifier, right? Interestingly, though, in this group, only Kate and Ash are addicts. And you'll understand better why going forward. Even though Kate doesn't qualify for substance use disorder, she might still be an addict. Furthermore, Kate is the only person in this particular lecture that's in recovery. And we're going to talk a bit more about what that means and how you can tell. So let's continue and keep these people in mind while you're thinking about everything we're going to be talking about. So addiction is characterized by these 5 key points. This is the American Society for Addiction Medicine's definition. It's an inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral, craving, or increased hunger for drugs or rewarding experience. There's diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and dysfunctional emotional responses. So there's all these things go into addiction. Now, this is really important to keep in mind as we continue forward. I'm going to be refining some of that definition in a little bit. First, let's talk a little bit about history. So we have all the way back to 10,000 before the Common Era. In China, there were writings, there were scrolls and drawings of alcohol use. And then during 1400 to 1800 of the Common Era, that was what we would consider really to be the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. And this picture is a great example of that, where alcohol for a lot of Europeans at that time was considered sort of a gift from God. But even the clergy, they would all say that intemperance, alcohol in excess, is sinful, right? And we actually brought this into modern times in the U.S. Census in 1880. They surveyed for it, and at that time it was called dipsomania. Then the disease model really came into existence during the 1920s, but then it grew in the 1940s with the publication of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the 1960s, it really gained greater traction with the publication of Dr. Jelinek. And I'm going to show you what's called the Jelinek curve in a couple seconds. In the DSM-1, DSM-1 was really based on psychoanalysis. And so one of the things that they had at that time was a focus on personality. And they had both a brain disorders area and alcoholic dementia and alcohol intoxication were considered brain disorders, whereas alcoholism was considered a kind of sociopathic personality. Then in DSM-2, they actually had a definition for alcoholism and alcohol addiction. It wasn't until DSM-3 when they started moving away from that to a more behavioral characteristic of diagnosis in the DSM, and it changed to the ideas of use, abuse, and dependence. And what we know now as addiction is more in line with the idea of dependence. And it's slowly continuing to move further away from the idea of alcoholism or addiction as a personality type, more to diagnosis based on the behavioral manifestations in DSM-5 of a brain disorder, brain rewiring associated with the way that the substances influence the mind. In some ways, in a good way, in some ways, this could be a bad thing. One of the big things is we no longer actually diagnose either dependence or addiction or alcoholism as we used to know it, or the way that we think about it. So it's really important to understand that we don't currently diagnose addiction, even though addiction has been classified as a disease for quite some time. So if we look at the differences between substance use disorder and what we know to be addiction, substance use disorders strictly follow the diagnostic criteria as prescribed by the DSM-5. That's the one that we use now. And so that's the one to use when you're working in a practice. You would diagnose substance use disorder, but you might be working with a person who has addiction concerns. So if we look at this Venn diagram here, we can think of how many people out there qualify for a substance use disorder. I'm going to show you some statistics later to show it's actually a very large number. But how many people within that group actually would fit the label of addiction, would accept the label of addiction, that probably have addiction? It's a very small number of the people with a substance use disorder, especially depending on if we use a liberal or a conservative way of interpreting diagnostic criteria. Now, addiction, or alcoholism in this case, this is a very important definition. It's a chronic, heritable, often progressive and fatal disease. Now, this is the way the ICD-10 classifies substance dependence, alcohol dependence disorder. Chronic, heritable, progressive, fatal, right? Every single year, according to the World Health Organization, something like 3 million people die specifically because of alcohol-related concerns. It's officially listed under the Americans with Disabilities Act as a disability. Both addiction and alcoholism are listed as disabilities. So I find it really fascinating that we diagnose substance use disorder and we don't diagnose addiction, but it's both listed as a disease, so technically it could be diagnosed, and it's classified as a disability that deserves and legally requires accommodations. So this is a Jelinek curve that I was telling you about, and this really is demonstrating the progressive nature of the illness. If you start up on the top left side, and if you were to consider this to be a timeline of when someone begins to experience some alcoholism and how it progresses all the way down to the bottom, and then it begins going back up after the person experiences rehabilitation. And so it's important to know when working with a person with addiction, it doesn't have to go all the way to the bottom. But if the person who is truly suffering from alcoholism or addiction gets into this particular track and they don't experience recovery, then this is the track that they will most likely follow. And then again, that's the track they'll most likely follow once they get into recovery. And at the end, at the very bottom there, the obsessive drinking continues in vicious circles, typically ends in death, institutions, and jails. So this is another thing that I like to talk about when I talk about addiction, because it's the idea of it being a disease. And one of the things that really makes for strong evidence that addiction is a disease is when we compare it to other diseases. Okay, so on here you can see this is from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and they're talking about how often relapse occurs. Now, relapse in this case, when we're talking about a disease state, in addiction it means return to use, and we're going to talk more about what relapse means and different definitions of relapse. But with things like diabetes or hypertension or asthma, what it's talking about is how powerful the symptoms are. And on the right side here, what you see is what happens when a person experiences treatment. And say the severity of the conditions on the left side there, looking up and down, and you can see a person with, say, high blood pressure. They've got this disease and it's getting worse and worse and worse until they almost have a stroke, right? And then they go to the hospital and it gets completely under control. And where it says during there, that's the idea of them being in the hospital. And then they leave the hospital. And then the disease state starts to come back. Maybe they quit dieting appropriately, taking too much salt in, right? And the disease comes back. The disease state resumes. That would be considered a relapse in the medical sense. And we see this exact same pattern as it relates to addiction. Another thing that I like to talk about as it relates to addiction that is the way that it can kill you. There's two primary ways that any disease can kill you. And both of the examples that I use are on this left side right here. Diabetes rarely kills people because of a sudden diabetic episode. Usually what happens is the person experiences diabetes and it's the slow progression. They start to lose limbs. The diabetes starts to affect other parts of their body, and eventually their body crosses over this threshold where they cannot return from. And it's a slow decline until mortality. Now, asthma, on the other hand, I can't tell you exactly where it comes from, but I remember I was in a lecture at Georgia Tech and there was a lady who was talking about asthma who was an expert on the disorder. And one of the things about asthma is that very often if asthma kills someone, it's very sudden. They die during an asthma attack and you never know exactly when it's going to happen. And there's some equal sort of probability that no matter how the severity of your asthma is, whenever someone has an acute asthma situation, there's an equal probability of that being the one for them. And so addiction is just like both of those conditions with the progressive nature. A person uses methamphetamine, right? And they go along and they're using it IV style and they're okay. And then all of a sudden they get hepatitis C from using a dirty needle, or they acquire HIV, right? And their body crosses over that threshold and there's no coming back. Or it could be that a person's drinking and they don't drink all the time, but when they do, they black out. And one day they go for a drive, right? And they didn't know it, that was going to be the last time they got behind a wheel, but that was the end of it. And one of those things with alcoholism and addiction is it touches our lives so much because almost everybody can tell you, especially now with the way that opioids have been growing in use, that almost everyone I know can tell you a story about someone they've lost from alcohol or addiction in some way. And so that's one of the reasons why addiction is so important to work with. It's because we're working with people's lives here. People's lives are on the stake, and that's not always the case with different psychiatric conditions, with social anxiety, things like that. It might not be a life or death situation. With addiction, genuine addiction, it's a life or death situation. Etiology, we're going to talk a bit about etiology here. What causes addiction? So with any disease state, when we're diagnosing something, we're looking at a predisposition in this case. Remember, the definition of addiction had heritable in there. But there are other things as well that can predispose someone to addiction. One of the big ones, though, is genetics, and I'm going to show you something that's going to talk a little bit more about that. But genetics, the link is very high. The amount of trauma, if a person has early trauma or family dysfunction. Social pressure is a really big deal. If teenagers get involved in substance use in high school, the odds of them developing a substance use disorder or addiction is very high compared to those that don't. So there's social pressures in there that's a potential predisposing factor. But then there's actual exposure, right? A person can have all the genetics in the world, but if they never drink, they're not going to be an alcoholic, right? So it's important, though, to know that exposure to substances is very common in the U.S. More than half of every person in the United States drinks on a yearly basis. Within the past 12 months, the National Institute of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, half of everyone surveyed say, yeah, I've had a drink in the past year, right? Cannabis use in the past month in young adults, so this is just people between the age of 18 and 26, 1 out of 5 reported that they had used cannabis in the past month. Now, this next one I found really interesting because I thought it was going to be much higher. This is the lifetime prevalence of exposure to opioids, and that's for medical purposes too. Both of these are combined. It's if it was ever prescribed, if a person took opioids. And then we get into the other drugs like ecstasy, cocaine, other things like that. And what we find is with those particular kinds of substances, the highly illegal, felonious drugs, the actual exposure rates to those are very low in the round of 5% or less range. But there's a really interesting thing where this differentiation between externalizing versus internalizing tendencies can sort of give you a prediction of whether or not a person's going to be more likely to develop an alcohol problem versus a drug use problem. And so then we can look at how many people end up developing the disease state. And this sort of fits in with that whole, you won't develop the disease state unless you have the predisposition. Just like if you have the predisposition, you won't develop the disease state if you're never exposed, right? So it takes both of those. And that's why even though more than half of people in the United States surveyed said, yes, I had a drink in the past year, the vast majority of people don't have the predisposition. And so only roughly 8% of people qualified for a substance use disorder in the United States in the past year. And then on top of that, we can look at how many of them were an alcohol-related substance use disorder, and that's 3 out of every 4 people who qualify for an substance use disorder qualify for an alcohol use disorder. And really, if we just look at the numbers, that's really purely because alcohol is so prevalent, so common. And a lot of people think so much about the opioid crisis and the drugs and all this stuff. At the end of the day, alcohol still has the biggest impact when it comes to alcoholism and addiction. It still kills more people. It's still a bigger concern. But because it's legal, because there's lobbyists and commercials, it gets glossed over. So this is a graph that's showing you the tendency for an individual to develop different forms of addiction. Now, FHD stands here for a family history of drinking. And the way they calculated that was just counting up the number of people in a person's family that had a drinking problem. And it was just mother, father, mother's parents, father's parents. And what they found was if a person had a family history of drinking, that was like 3 out of those 5 people had a family history of drinking, then the odds of them developing alcoholism versus not developing alcoholism was extremely significant, regardless of whether or not, so the middle line right there where it says adolescent family harmony, that's whether or not the parents divorced, if there were arguments in the home, things like that, right? So The chance of developing alcoholism, if you have that genetic predisposition, are so incredibly high because the exposure rates to alcohol in society are so high that it generally doesn't matter whether or not you had a difficult family environment or not. If you get exposed, it's like the fire was waiting to get started. We just needed that little candle to get it going. Um, Again, that's kind of an exaggeration, and it's not necessarily true for everyone. We're talking about population level means, but it's something to keep in mind, and it actually relates to that externalizing, because we know that externalizing behaviors are actually very related to things like ACEs and family trauma, and there's some gender differences as well, with males being much more likely to develop an externalizing type disorder. And what you can see here is that if you have the family history of drinking, which is sort of a predisposition for drinking in general, and that is negatively associated with family harmony. So the less family drinking history, the more likely you're to have a good family life is what they found. But if you had that and then a higher likelihood of family disharmony, if there was more drinking in the household, those children who grew up in those households were much more likely to develop a drug problem or a problem where it's polysubstance use, so alcohol and drugs. And so that's just sort of showing that you got the predisposition, then you got different kinds of exposure can lead to different kinds of disease states. So we're going to talk a little bit about the subjective experience of people who have addiction concerns. And one of the big things that has to do with that, if you remember that ASAM definition that I told you, a big part of it was craving. So according to Alcoholics Anonymous, a really good way to think about addiction, and Alcoholics Anonymous is a fantastic book. Consider it like a case study. Multiple case studies. We use these all the time as journal articles, and we dive deep into what could this case study be telling us when we're working with clients. But then for some reason we overlook this particular book, and I think that could be an oversight in our profession, especially if you want to work with recovering people. This is a great example of narratives that can help you better understand in working with clients that identify as addicts and alcoholics, and that's a really important thing to know. So one of those things that Alcoholics Anonymous points out is that craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average typical drinker. So one of the common things that addicts or alcoholics experience is craving. And if you remember in the ASAM definition, it talks about a hunger. And that's because this craving, this deep craving experience and hunger are so similar. It's a lot like feeling hungry for something, because the parts of your mind, your brain, that are responsible for generating this craving experience are the same parts of your brain that are responsible for generating the sensation of hunger. Your brain takes the chemical and puts it at the same place in your survival system as things like oxygen and food and love and all that stuff. And so that's where the craving comes from, deep there in the brain. And so that's kind of the experience. It's a, I have to have it sort of experience that addicts and alcoholics will be very capable of describing to you. Then there's an emotional experience, right? Restless, irritable, discontented, pitiful, and incomprehensible demoralization. And these things go together, and part of that's because that mental experience, right? If we think about cognitive therapy, if we think about rational emotive behavioral therapy, there's a event, a behavior, and a consequence, right? So the event here is the craving, right? The mental experience is, I gotta have a drink. It'll be different this time, right? Something like that that leads to a drink. One of these great lines in here, the idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker, is a really clear idea. And when we think about the code of ethics for counselors, the first thing to think about is client autonomy. And when working with an addict and an alcoholic, this becomes very difficult because the addiction, and you'll hear me maybe talk about it more that way, the addiction takes over. And it's like it's got a mind of its own. And so a person will tell you, yeah, I'm in control. I can quit whenever I want to. And it's this place where they no longer have the autonomy, especially if they're dependent. Because maybe from an unconscious standpoint, their mind is protecting them from a full realization at that time because of how painful or how much it would be. And so sometimes when working with people like this, it's important to know if they're a threat to themselves, if they were to begin detoxing from things like alcohol, especially alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, that they might need to be hospitalized or they could die. And part of that is because even though they should be able to make their decisions for themselves, they're actually in a place where we need to help restore them to their autonomy because the disease has the reins. If you're working with a person and if you were walking through the woods and you found a person that was riding on the back of a tiger, you wouldn't yell at them, hey, how did you get on the back of that tiger? Let's figure out how you got up there, right? No, you would get them off of the tiger. And then we'll worry about how you got on the tiger so we can keep you off of it in the future. But first, we got to get you off of the tiger, right? So let's talk a little bit about identity and stigma because we're talking about these labels. It might be extremely important for people who are addicts or alcoholics to be able to identify with those labels, especially if they're going to be joining in to AA or NA or some other 12-step group, which I'm a big advocate for. And you'll see the research is very clear that that is really one of the best potential options that they could have. It's important for them to be able to get this label, to identify it with themselves on a personal level and the disease model. However, it is discouraged for counselors or psychologists or any mental health provider to label them as an alcoholic. This might be one of the big reasons why we don't diagnose people that way. And Dr. Ashford at Kennesaw State University in Georgia has been doing a lot of really great research on this. If you call someone an addict, it reinforces certain ideas. It's very stigmatizing. And one of the things that this Boykel, I don't have no idea how to pronounce that name, but that stigma against addicts and alcoholics in society is so prevalent that in general, healthcare providers provide them in general very poor service, often because they just think they're drug seeking. I know a person who had been sober, completely off of any alcohol or substances for 4 or 5 years, and they went to their doctor, and the doctor was treating them like a second-class citizen, in their words, because the doctor thought they just wanted pills, and really what they wanted was to get their blood checked and stuff like that for a regular checkup. And so the doctor just sort of looked down on them the whole time. They've been sober for years. So stigma is real, and in our society, it seems that addicts and alcoholics are one group that it's actually socially acceptable to stigmatize and talk about how they're terrible people in public, and no one confronts them. So that's a real problem. Let's move on to talking about recovery, and I'm going to do my best to speed this up a bit. Recovery is really important, and it's distinct from abstinence, right? Abstinence is the cessation of mind-altering substances. But then you hear the word sober. So what does sober mean? And there's different ways to look at it depending on who you're looking at. Is it the stages of change? This Betty Ford panel article is really great. It was one of the first things that define recovery as a voluntarily maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety. So abstinence is important in this definition. Personal health and citizenship. Citizenship's so important. Both of these definitions kind of imply citizenship, but one of them has the sobriety or the abstinence while the other one does not. Isn't that interesting that recovery doesn't necessarily always mean 100% abstinence all the time? Brown and Ashford, that's the guy from Kennesaw State, says recovery is an individualized, intentional, voluntary, very similar there, dynamic, changes, grows, and relational process involving sustained efforts to improve wellness at a global level. That could mean vocational, that could mean spiritual, that could mean interpersonal, educational. There are different ways to look at wellness, not just physical health, and not just abstinence, but a continual process, right? Voluntarily, so important, so important. If the person isn't staying sober or abstaining for their own purposes, then it doesn't necessarily fit the definition of recovery. And it's a lifestyle, and citizenship has to do with this common thing. And they arrived at this definition by interviewing recovered addicts and alcoholics, people who have been sober for for a longer period of time. Typically more than 5 years is what's considered the termination stage of change. And what you typically find is with people who have recovered, who are in recovery for a long period of time, they develop this gratitude and they show a desire to give back to their community from a sense of having gained so much and been given so much. It's this really fundamentally shift, and in the AA book they call it a complete psychic change, a massive rearrangement of personal values. And I think one of the great things in working with people who are recovering, who are struggling, is that when you get the chance to work with someone who stays abstinent for an extended period of time, more than a year, more than 6 months, somewhere along the line a shift happens and you can see it. And it's the most magnificent thing. And I really tell you to hold on to those little nuggets. It's like the story of the lost sheep, what's it called? The shepherd goes and the one sheep comes back, right? And you celebrate that, because if you work in this field on the front lines, you're going to see people dying. And to see one person change their life and how much good it does makes all of the heartache of watching so many people not all worth it. So let's talk about relapse, right? So there's this really great story to help you get the idea between a slip, a lapse, and a relapse. And the Ashford article about stigma actually really recommends using the term recurrence of use, as it has less stigma. But it's important to be able to characterize these three things this way, and you'll see why in a second. So imagine a person walking through the snow, and they're walking along and they hit some ice and they go, whoa, but they don't fall down, right? And they keep going on their way. Well, that's what we would consider like a slip, right, when it comes to use. And the idea here is they experienced a urge or something like that, or they were in a slippery situation and they could have fallen, right? That's the thing. It's they could have fallen. They could have used. They got close, but they didn't, and they kept going. Now, the next one is imagine that exact same person, and they hit that ice, and they slip, and then they fall. Wham! And it hurts, right? But they get back up really quickly because they still got ways to go, and they continue on their way. Well, that would be a lapse in this case. That would be a person who experiences a slip. The slip turns into use, and they realize maybe the next day, oh my goodness, this was such a setback. I can't believe it. And they get back up and they continue on their journey working with a counselor or however else they're working on themselves at that point in time. Much like that picture that I showed you earlier comparing addiction to other diseases, it doesn't become a full-blown relapse until the level of use that the person is experiencing and the consequences they're experiencing from it reach a similar level to what it was prior to whatever form of treatment they began with, right? So if the story of walking on ice, it's the person's walking and they have the slip and then they have the fall, but then once they get on the ground, they think, oh, that's it. I'm just going to stay here. And they're in the cold and they're on the ground and they're freezing, but they just don't want to get back up again, right? That's a good way to think about these three things, especially when we consider the Marlatt sort of framework of how relapses occur. And you see it starts with this high-risk situation on the left side in the middle, right? And that's the slip, right? And then what you see there is there's either a coping response or there's no coping response in the moment. And that could, if there's a coping response, it leads to increased self-efficacy and decreased probability of future use in situations like that. However, there's a place where it says decreased self-efficacy because of no coping response, and then there's an initial use of the substance. One of the things that I like to talk about with people who are recovering is the idea that they've got this battery of called NO, N-O, the NO battery. And this is actually a theory. It's called the resource depletion theory of relapse. And it has to do with your prefrontal cortex and things like that. But the idea is there's only so much no that you've got inside of you if you're not engaging in self-care, if they're not going to meetings and stuff like that. And because you can't isolate the alcoholic or the addict from temptation. It's impossible. There's going to be commercials. There's going to be times when bad things happen in life. And so temptation is going to occur. High-risk situations are going to occur. And every single person is capable in those situations of going without using. But if you're in those situations over and over and over again, then your resources get depleted and that no battery runs out, and suddenly you're going to get yes. And in the AA fellowship, a lot of times people say, if you hang out at the barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. And that's the way to kind of think about that, and how slip, lapse, and relapse, just because a person has a slip doesn't mean they're going to have a lapse. But if a person is continually in situations where they're slipping, or if a person's slipping a lot, lots and lots of cravings going on, and they're not doing anything to help deal with it, then eventually they're probably going to fall down. Relapse rates are extremely high for alcoholism in the first year. If you look at this one, you see that this article showed that 92% of people who enter treatment will not stay sober a full year. Tobacco use, very similar. And if you look down, you see that it can be similar or more so than psychiatric disorders. So when we're working with people who are recovering, it's important to keep in mind that it takes some time. Usually it takes some practice, but there's a lot of hope. There's some silver linings that I want you to see and know about too. The evidence is very clear. Recovery is attainable, and sobriety, meaningful long-term sobriety, is attainable for those people who continue to work at it. This is another thing to think about, and this has to do with that idea of if you hang out at the barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut, high-risk situations. And so this was a study where they interviewed people after they went to treatment, and they interviewed them on a monthly basis for a year after they went to treatment. And they asked the ones who used, what caused you to use? And what they found was early on in recovery, so this first one, craving had a really big impact. But in the people who didn't use, this is very important, if you look after 6 months, so month 8, month 10, and month 12, craving was no longer the cause of the use. And part of that is because craving is generated by the effects of the chemical still in the body when the chemical hits the brain in some degree. And so the longer a person can go without giving into craving, they build up that ability. And some of the metabolites say, there's a man named Dr. Talbot who was in Atlanta, and a story he used to tell was that alcohol metabolites stay in your body fat for about a year. And what happens is when the person stops using, they're living, and your body metabolizes fat cells, and every now and again some of the alcohol metabolites end up in your bloodstream, and when they get to the brain they trigger that craving, right? But if you can help the person make it past that 6-month point, and that's a really important point too in the stages of change, because at the 6-month point they're past the action stage, right? But what we still see here are that negative affect and social pressure continue to be very large causes of relapse. And what we can see too on the second, this is both by a Zawiak, I again don't know how to always pronounce people's names, but the one on the left is from the first study, and the one on the right is the follow-up study. And what we can see is that there were some gender differences in that men, to begin with, are much more likely to relapse from social pressure whereas women were more likely, at least for the first relapse, to relapse because of either craving or because of the experience of negative affect. So that's one of those things where it's important to keep gender in mind because different kinds of treatment things, different things to keep in mind of what's going to, for different clients, be more likely to contribute to a recurrence of use. So there's this thing called the socio-ecological model. If you've never seen it, there's a great, what's it called? TED Talk about this place called Rat Park. And what they talk about is they got these rats addicted to using opioids, and then depending on if the rats were in a stimulating social environment or if they were isolated in a place where they couldn't live, the ones that were isolated continued to use, whereas the ones that were placed in a different kind of environment actually weaned themselves off of the opioids. So what we see here is that there's this recovery-ready ecosystems model. And as counselors, mental health providers of any kind, we play a social justice advocacy kind of role. And one of the big things that we can do for people who are in recovery is advocate at different levels so that there are resources in place to build a recovery-oriented society. There's this thing called recovery capital, and people who have the opportunity to find meaningful employment, people who have the opportunity for education. One of the biggest barriers to treatment for women is the need to care for children. A lot of, I know in Atlanta, there's this place called My Sister's House, and it's the only treatment place that I know of in all of Atlanta that will allow a single mother who is wanting to recover to bring her children with her to treatment. And there just aren't enough places like that. And so that fits into that community level. How can we offer people the services that they need to be able to recover? Because if we have a better environment for recovery, the chances that they're going to be able to enter that recovery lifestyle is much more likely. So a friend of mine who's in our program here named Alan Crutchfield, if you'd like to talk to him about this study, he is a resource available to you here at FSU. He did this study, and this was the results. What they did was they looked at people who had been abstinent from substances for different levels of time, but always more than a year, I want to say. And they looked at what predicted the length of time someone has been sober. Now, other than age, which is pretty obvious, a person can't have been sober for 30 years if they're only 30, right? The only other thing that was a significant predictor was educational or vocational achievement. And this is one of those places that people might not think necessarily that career counseling is something that can help someone stay sober. But if we look back here again, right, education, developing a new identity, things like that can really play into and having meaningful employment can help a person stay stable, to be able to live somewhere safe, to help their children, right? And so that's another place where that socio-ecological and different counseling modalities can be an evidence-based practice in working with recovering people. What's the role of mutual aid groups? So 12-step recovery is the most common kind of mutual aid group. It started in 1935. It's voluntary. It's free of charge. However, there are some ethical considerations. If you look at these 12 steps, you're going to notice it says God a lot. Well, what do we do when we have a client who is an atheist, right? Because that's a kind of identity, a cultural competency. How do we help them be able to benefit from these organizations? Well, that's where this kind of therapy called 12-step facilitation comes in. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I encourage you, if you want to work with this group, to get an idea of what 12-step facilitation is, because AA is very accepting of people who are atheists. It's helping the person who's atheist develop the awareness that they can be a part of this group and still have their own opinions and their own ideals and walk their own path their own way. They don't have to do everything the same way as everyone else in the group. and they can still be welcome and they can still get the benefits from it and be true to themselves. Um, there's also some potential ethical considerations related to gender, depending on where people go. It's important to know that AA isn't a bunch of professionals that are getting together. It's a bunch of lay people, and some of them are very sick. And occasionally there are people who act in a predatory manner. So to also help people be aware, to take care of themselves, to be safe, to find safe ways to organize and be a part of this organization is an important ethical consideration as well. One of the big reasons to support AA in here is there's 53,000 AA groups and 15,000 NA groups. And so that means a person can go to a meeting every day, which is something AA typically recommends. It's called 90 and 90. There is another group, though, called Smart Recovery. If a person isn't willing to try out AA, Smart Recovery is this one of the other largest groups. It's based on REBT. It is voluntary, but to have a Smart Recovery meeting, they have to have facilitators. They have to go to training. One interesting thing about Smart Recovery is they do not have people identify as alcoholic or addict while they're there because they eschew the label. They don't want them to get the stigma or the identity, right? One of the problems, though, with Smart Recovery is there aren't nearly as many meetings. There's only 353 registered groups in the thing that I saw. It was a little bit older, but they could probably not go to a meeting in certain places. I came from the Atlanta region. There was only like 4 meetings in all of Atlanta, Georgia. For Smart Recovery. And so to be aware where the resources are so that the person can get the most benefit from it or finding different resources, it's really going to depend on what your client wants and what's going to work best with them and what they are willing to do. So a theoretical idea here is if you think about what AA and NA talk about when you hear people, they're going to say there is a spiritual sacrifice, spiritual awakening. And there is a self-sacrifice in working with others that really helps them stay sober. And that in that recovery definition by the Betty Ford panel, you'll see there's that citizenship piece, right? From an Adlerian perspective, what's developing there is that community mindedness and that connectivity, right? So even though AA is saying, well, yes, it's our higher power and it's God, there's different ways to look at how these things help. Another way you can think about it is cognitive behavioral. AA and NA have these 12 steps, and there's very cognitive pieces in there, and they say stuff like a day at a time and disputing irrational thoughts, and Smart Recovery does the same, right? So there's clear theoretical underpinnings for how these things work. So don't let the language of the organizations deter you from being able to see the benefit. One interesting thing, too, is this identity theory, and the identity from just being, well, I'm just a drunk, or I'm just an addict, to I'm being a recovering person. Well, if the person, all they think of themselves is that they're drunk, or they're not very good, right? Or this could be emotion from, I'm just a horrible person, I don't know what I use, but I'm going to stop because I'm awful. If I don't stop it, then they're in the relapse situation they end up using, then it reinforces this idea where I'm a horrible person, right? But then they can go into the disease model. It's no longer I'm a horrible person. It's I have a disease. Well, what happens when you have a disease? Can you use safely? No, I'm not. So what does a person who knows they have a disease that has taken that label? Well, then they know that they can't use, so they have to learn new coping mechanisms, right? If a person then identifies as I'm a recovering person, well, when they're a recovering person and they enter into this place where something happens in their environment, what's the output? How's a recovering person act, right? So the ability to interface with these different social organizations can develop a different identity, and it can change from the identity of the drunk or the dope user or a meth head or whatever they had in their mind to that recovering person. Then it can help them create a new identity and a new set of behaviors and a new way of thinking and feeling about themselves. And that's some of the power with some of these self-help and with the idea of recovery. And the idea of recovery is distinct from the idea of addiction. They're two different things. It's not one thing and two different poles. It's two things that can sort of run together and make all the difference for the person when one of them becomes more powerful than the other. Does treatment work? Yes, it does. One thing that This is Mr. William White. He wrote these different, very long articles, but they're great. And one of the things that's clear in the literature is how many people who qualify for a substance use disorder, not addiction, mind you, substance use disorder, at some point in their life will recover. So you see the numbers on the right side, but on the left side you see different base rates, or what the percentages are based off of all the literature. And in general, what you can see is that about 14.3% of everyone in the United States in general, at some point in their life will qualify for an alcohol use disorder. But then you get down to the estimated number of adults in remission or recovery, and that becomes 60% of those people who at some point in their life had a substance use disorder eventually reach recovery. And in this case, that's a recovery that's below the threshold for a diagnosis. That's not addiction, right? We're not talking about addiction. We're talking about recovery. And we're talking about no longer qualifying for a diagnosis. So one of the interesting things too is if we look at the differences between the population of people who end up in treatment, especially if they're younger, if they're 18, 17, 22, right? The people that end up going to treatment, residential treatment, are much more likely to have comorbid diagnoses, and much heavier substance use at that time. And so we're looking at a different group of people. One of the things that I knew about, but I wouldn't tell my people who are currently in residence, is that about half of all the people in the community that might qualify for a substance use disorder, but I'm going to run back here real quick, pretty far, to this diagram right here, okay? If we look at that circle of just substance use disorder in general, about half of those people in a given year will enter what we call spontaneous remission, and that's that they'll just desist enough. And from our case vignettes, John here, I know John is not his real name, but John got married and he had some kids and he got a new job and he just stopped. He just stopped drinking, stopped using, you know. He never identified as an addict or an alcoholic. He has never identified with that. And so John actually doesn't qualify as an addict or alcoholic, but he was a person with substance use disorder that spontaneously remitted. Kate, on the other hand, also someone that I know, not her name, did qualify as an addict or alcoholic, and Kate is still an addict or an alcoholic, because once you have a disease, a chronic disease, it doesn't go away. But Kate does not qualify for a substance use disorder, and Kate went to treatment and is continuing to do the things so that she will not return to using substances. Ash may or may not qualify for substance use disorder, depending on the severity and how you interpret the substance use disorder qualifications. However, in talking with Ash, Ash identified as an addict. When I began talking to her about what is an addict, even though it's just cannabis, mind you, she identified with the craving and the thoughts and the behaviors and the emotions as it related to cannabis. So because Ash identified as an addict, Ash qualifies as an addict. It doesn't matter the severity of use. It matters on if they identify. Now, if they identify, we have something to work on. We can develop ideas of what to do, how to help. So we're going to jump forward again to does treatment work? Yes, it does. Again, what we can see here is that we have differences between if a person goes to treatment. Now, this is the same William White article, and if you look, I'm going to look over here. We're going to look right here, right? So this is the probability if a person decides they want to try and quit. What are the odds that they're going to stay quit the first time or that specific year? You can see it's pretty low, right? What's the chance of them actually entering remission, that is going below the threshold for a diagnosis? within the first decade of them trying. Look how high that gets for cocaine. If the person keeps trying, if we keep working with them, they're very likely to enter remission. What's the lifetime probability? It says right here, almost every single person who qualified for a cocaine use disorder will enter remission at some point in time in their lifetime. That doesn't say how long they're going to stay abstinent, but it says they have a good chance if we're working with them and we can help them reach that recovery identity, that recovery lifestyle. They've got a fighting chance, right? It's all about that hope and helping them see, hey, you may not get it this time. It's all about planting that seed. How can we connect you with the recovery community? How can you identify with that recovery lifestyle? How can we work with you so that you can get to that place where you can change meaningfully and become a different person? So one of those big ways, again, is with Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. The evidence is very strong that this is the best evidence-based way of helping someone maintain and achieve long-term sobriety. This Dr. Violent, he followed some alcoholics for 70 years. Now, at the time, they were diagnosing alcoholics, so I'm using it that way. It wasn't necessarily the people identified with it because it's research. We're kind of hamstringed by the methodology here and the terminology they use. But what they found, there were some really important things in here. One of them was they compared people who were going to college to people who came from an inner city. And what they found was that it didn't matter. It didn't matter what age, where was the big one? No, it's not on here. But what mattered was there was significant difference between education levels between these groups, socioeconomic status. The evidence is clear. It didn't matter. The people who came from a tough lifestyle had just as much chance of getting sober and staying sober and developing that recovery lifestyle. But what you can see down here is the big difference between the people who stayed using their entire lives up until the age of 70. The average number of AA meetings that they attended in, I think, a year was 8, plus or minus 30 or 2, right? Versus the people that went to 137 or 143, right? The number of meetings that you go to directly relates to the probability that you'll achieve long-term sobriety. And that's one of the reasons why 12-step facilitation is so important. Let's look at the next slide. So here's another example. This is what we call a dose-response relationship, and it's really important for something to be an evidence-based treatment for pharmacotherapy, is that there has to be a clear dose response. That's why on the back of your Advil bottle it says take 2. It's because they've done all of this research where they know that if you don't at least take 2, then it's probably not going to work for you. And what we can see over here is that the number's very low. It's on average 1 a week. That's the minimum effective dose that appears in the literature. About 1 meeting a week, so that's 52 a year. And I couldn't find the article again, but it depends on how much they start off with. And again, when I was working, I did work as head therapist, interim director of a treatment facility. And so just like I wouldn't tell my guys that are brand new, hey, half of the people who have this condition, as long as they're in the community, just spontaneously remit. So you don't have to do anything, because that is something that people will interpret as, oh, great, I don't have to stop. I don't have to try because I'll just spontaneously remit. Flip a coin. That's going to be me. The thing is, they say 90 and 90, and with 12-step facilitation, you want the person to be able to buy in, to be able to be part of the group, to develop those social sober connections, right? And if the person is, we're telling them 90 and 90, but then maybe they know in their head, or you've already told them, oh, well, I only have to go to 1 a week anyway, because that's what the literature shows, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot when you're working with them. So this is one of those places where maybe not telling the client everything is, I wouldn't hide it from them. Oftentimes what I would tell guys that I was working with was, there's a certain number of meetings per week that needs it to be effective. And the day that you bring me that blue chip that you made it a year sober, I'll tell you how much it is. And it never seemed to make clients not trust me or believe me or anything like that. But this is just one of those things to know. AA does have a dose-response relationship, and for that reason, we can make the argument that it is a meaningful treatment in addition to the literature. So how are we going to measure success with individuals? So there's different ways of measuring abstinence. This is again from that William White article, and it depends in the research how they measure success. Is it continuous abstinence? Is it just abstinence at the time when you call them, hey, are you abstinent? If they say yes, well, there you go, that's abstinence. A lot of insurance companies will consider to be an evidence-based treatment if it will help a person stay abstinent for 6 months after treatment, right? So if we think about with recovery, if we're thinking about a disease, there's a lot more life left than just 6 months, okay? So there is a strong push in the literature with some of the addiction specialists with the recovery community that really we need to be looking at 5 years. Will it help a person stay sober for 5 years? Achieve recovery might be another way of thinking about it. Is it complete abstinence? If the person was an IV heroin user and they're no longer using heroin, but they're drinking on the weekends, is that still success? Is that abstinence? It's abstinence from heroin, right? So it's going to depend on how we measure recovery. How do we measure success? If we're measuring it in abstinence, there's different ways to do that. Are we measuring it in recovery? And there's a strong argument that it should be measured with recovery. This idea that recovery is self-evident. That's that thing I was telling you, that when you're working with a person and they get to that place where they can get into recovery, you can see the change is remarkable. It's self-evident. It's like saying, yes, this person is a changed person. And often the people that are close to them, you will see a change in the client before the client knows it in themselves. And it's a fundamentally emancipatory set of processes. And so that relates back to that idea I was talking about with the ethics of autonomy, right? I'm taking away this client's autonomy by sending them to detox against their will. It happens. Sometimes it's necessary. But it's understanding that it's me helping the client become autonomous. Now, I'm never going to recommend just jumping straight in. Oh, well, this client, I'm not going to tell them about it. I'm just sending them straight to detox, right? It needs to be a process. And depending on the client, in Georgia, where I'm from, there were 2 ways to do it. A mental health provider who had 1013 privileges could commit someone for detox, or a court could. And people, had talked to them all the time. Hey, how can I force my loved one to go to detox? It's like, you can't. And even if you brought them to me or brought them to someone else, we might not, right? Sometimes it's a really ugly thing to do, but there have been plenty of times where I've seen seasoned members of this profession saying, oh, you want the person to go to detox? All right, get them drunk, take them to the hospital, get them to drink a bottle of vodka, then just walk them right into the ER, because they're more likely to send them to detox there. The only other way is to try and get a judge to do it, and I've seen legitimate times where the judge should have done it, and the judge is like, no, I'm not going to do this. So another thing to think about when we think about those abstinence rates in the first year of recovery is that abstinence is the ideal, but harm reduction is more practical. And if you look at the right side, you can see some different ways to measure a person. If these things are happening, we're moving them towards that recovery lifestyle, right? Just because they're not fully abstinent, if we can help keep them healthy, if we can help minimize that harm until such a point in their life where they do finally reach that year where they're going to stay sober, and they're going to reach that recovery lifestyle, then we're doing our job, right? Plant the seed, help them stay alive. There was a 23-year-old kid I was working with. Call him a kid now. It's just because he was immature, but he was using meth, and he was injecting it and smoking it, and he was doing it to the point where it was destroying his heart. And he just kept getting into fights, and we had to kick him out. But he came back. He was and this is something else to know. The rates of suicide are extremely high with recovering people, with people in especially early sobriety, and people who have long-term sobriety that go back to using. There's an extreme risk. Um, and so with this client, it would have been super important and to attend to those mental health concerns at the same time we're working on achieving recovery, because he died a week after he turned 23. And it was incredibly sad because I know that if we had just kept working together, he could have made it. Everyone has a chance. I'm thinking about another client right now who he was actually the first person that I ever got to do therapy with while I was still a student, because I was volunteering at the place that I became the director. And so I was working with him, and he seemed like he was okay, but then I could see that he started to deteriorate. Um, his self-talk changed, and I could see his mood change, but he was hiding it from us. And he went home for a 24-hour pass, and this is where harm reduction comes in, um, because and as counselors, it's important to be advocates for harm reduction, even though it's very unsavory in some ways. Things like needle exchanges um, don't fit with politics very well. But if it's a matter of saving lives, then it's worth it. And we know that if we can help postpone mortality, that the odds of a person achieving recovery are very high. So something like moderation management is worth thinking about with some people who aren't ready for abstinence yet. And moderation management is an evidence-based practice. Division 12 of the APA talks about moderation management. This is the idea that a person who is currently qualifying for an alcohol use disorder, many of them, depending on the level of severity, if a person has clearly alcohol dependence, and if they've ever had withdrawals to the point where they had to go to detox, moderation management is not for them. It's not going to be the successful long-term choice for them. But if a person, say, is 24 and maybe they just don't have the coping skills, or they binge drink on the weekends or something, then and they don't identify as an alcoholic, then moderation management can be effective. This graph here shows you that people who use moderation management with something called oh man, moderation something. It's a website .org. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Boop boop boop. Okay, moderation management org. Moderation.org. That might be it. Welcome to Moderation Management, right? So they've got a web app, and this web app is great. The online support. That's specifically what this particular article is showing, is that people who no, we're gonna go back to, we're almost done. Thank you. If you made it this far, you've done great staying with me. So it's people who engage with moderation.com in addition to moderation management therapy typically do way better. How did I do this? There we go. So another thing to think about with opioid use is medication-assisted therapy. These are things like Suboxone, things like methadone, stuff like that. And the literature is very clear here as well. Medication-assisted therapy can be effective. It typically is not. There are plenty of clients that are going to come in. I remember working in a detox facility, and we had a client come in, and they swapped him from, he was taking OxyContin, and they put him on Suboxone, which is this buprenorphine. And he was like, I feel like $1,000,000. And it's like, well, you're still taking opioids, you know. And there are plenty of people out there that think that the best kind of lifestyle for them is just to take that the rest of their life. Ideally, they'll take it for maybe 6 months, and we'll help get them off of that as well, because it's still toxic. It's not great. It's better than heroin, right? So it's harm reduction. And if we work with them, most of them will eventually achieve sobriety as well. One of the things to see here is that's this line, that's methadone management versus waitlist or no treatment. And what you see is the number of people who are waitlisted who return to heroin use, right? And in this one, that's the number of people who are on methadone treatment who return to heroin use. Down here, though, we can see the mortality rates as well, right? Pay attention to this line. That's methadone versus nothing at all. And then these down here, this is a heroin, actually giving them heroin treatment. But you can see the people who are in methadone that died from it, 0, compared to the number that died while they were being waitlisted. So, I mean, it's a big difference. If a person is receiving treatment with this is that stepping stone, this is that harm reduction, this is that planting the seed. And in 12-step recovery and with 12-step facilitation or acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a second and show you a book that's a great manual that I'm a very big fan of, that it's 12-step facilitation plus mindfulness based plus acceptance and commitment. It's wonderful. Helping a person interface with AA or NA who is on medication-assisted therapy is also something that can be hard, because there are individuals inside of those programs that are very against it and will try to tell the person that you're not sober or something like that. And it's important to be able to work with them so they can get the benefits from the program, no matter what road of recovery that they're choosing. 12-step facilitation works. 12-step recovery works. And so this right here on this side is from the MATCH study. And we've got 3 different kinds of treatment. 12-step facilitation. This is motivational enhancement. So that's motivational interviewing right there. And then this one's just plain CBT. Now, the literature is fairly clear that no matter what kind of therapy you work with a person that's recovering, you can help them stay sober for about a year. But after that year, things really start to drop off. And what you see here is that across the board in what was called Project Match, which is a really big deal if you want to get interested in learning more about Project Match, it's really one of the gold standards for treatment. But 12-step facilitation and getting a person connected into 12-step recovery is the most evidence-based form of treatment. And this is a meta-analysis that was recently conducted in just the past couple of years. And what they find here, especially so 12 months, and then 24 months, 2 years, and then 3 years, these are the weighted averages of the odds of a person who participates or gets 12-step facilitation compared to other forms of treatment, whether or not they'll stay sober long term. So 12-step facilitation when working with this group with working with addiction is really the best option. And then this acceptance and commitment therapy. So there is some preliminary data. This was a pilot study. And so this one right here, this is 12-step facilitation. This is urinalysis and the percentage of people who passed urinalysis. So this was time 1, and that was at the beginning of therapy and how many people failed urinalysis. And then this was, so this was the number of people who passed drug screening objectively in this treatment facility. And then here, right, that stands for methadone maintenance. Okay, and what you see is that methadone maintenance without therapy is pretty ineffective at helping a person maintain abstinence by objective screening. Up here, though, you can see that at the end of treatment, if they're receiving methadone maintenance as well as either the ACT or the 12-step facilitation, about the same amount of them were able to pass a drug screening, but then it seemed to drop off. This was a follow-up that was done 6 months after they left treatment. And so this form of acceptance and commitment in this case was more likely to lead to a negative drug screening. This book over here, I've read it. It's really great. And it fits perfectly with 12-step facilitation and with 12-step, and when working with clients who are recovering from addiction. So I highly recommend it. This last thing to think about is the ASAM levels of care. And so this again relates to that idea that most people that you encounter are going to have a fairly mild to maybe moderate substance use disorder. But every now and again, you're going to come across a person that's drinking every day. There are only 3 substances, okay, that the withdrawals from those substances can kill you. They're alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. They can cause seizures, grand mal seizures called delirium tremens. And prior to having medication to assist people with this process, roughly 1 out of every 10 people who tried to come cold turkey off of alcohol would die. And so that's why there's these different levels of treatment. If a person that you're working with is finally at the point where they can get sober and they've been taking a lot of Xanax, or they've been taking a lot of, well, barbiturates aren't as prevalent anymore because they're highly toxic. They're like the crazy PCP version of Xanax. But if they're taking bars, then they should go to detox, because if they try and cold turkey that, they could potentially have a seizure. The other ones, cocaine, crack, meth, they're going to be angry. They're going to be very sleepy and very hungry, but the withdrawals won't kill them. Opiates and heroin, if a person were to pass away during that process, it's actually from dehydration. The withdrawals themselves aren't the dangerous thing. It's the dehydration. So yeah, go into detox for those. It's a good idea if the medical procedure is necessary, but in general, they're just going to wish they were dead because being dope sick is like getting the flu in less than an hour. And certain kinds of substances like fentanyl, the reason they're so addictive is that they cause withdrawals to happen within hours of taking it. It's absolutely horrible. So it's important that if you're going to be recommending care for your clients, if you're outpatient therapist or private practice, that you know the different ASAM levels and be able to help your client find the right level of care. If a person is going to be going for treatment for a residential program, there's lots of them out there. They're like 28-day programs, but the National Institute of Drug Abuse is very clear that for a treatment to be very effective, it needs to be at least 90 days. If you're going to be recommending a client go to treatment, a residential program, and you're only giving them options that are 28 days. Now, if the client's saying, I refuse to do 90 days, but they'll go to 28 days, of course, again, this is that harm reduction. Meet them where you can, do whatever you can, but really advocate for that 90-day thing. It's the official recommendation of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Can't go wrong there. So we talked about addiction. We talked about recovery. We talked about treatment. I'm really passionate about this. If you get into this kind of practice, it's magical and it's transformative, and I'd love to talk to anyone about it. Feel free to reach out to me. I look forward to talking to you, and thank you for watching the PowerPoint. Got some references for you too if you'd like to see them.